Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very cozy. If by cozy you mean horrifying, but at least historically far away. So grab some tea, dim the lights, and maybe make sure your blanket is tucked in. Because we're going to float back to the mid-14th century, when Europe was not exactly thriving, unless you consider rats and fleas part of the thriving community. This was the age of the Black Death. Now, you already know the basic outline. A plague rolls in, people start dying, and before you can say, oops, there goes half the village, entire communities are emptied out. But what I want to focus on tonight isn't the grim statistics or the dramatic church bells ringing for the 1,000th funeral of the week. We're not chasing the big kings and queens and their castles, no. We're looking at the ordinary people, the bakers, the farmers, the housewives. How exactly did they try to hide from this thing? What did survival strategy look like when you didn't have Netflix, antibiotics, or even soap that worked very well? Spoiler, it looked a lot like panic, desperation, and really bad ideas. So, the year is roughly 1347, and the plague is arriving in Europe through the Mediterranean ports. It probably hitched a ride on ships from Crimea, though medieval people didn't say, oh no, the fleas on rats carried Yersinia pestis. They said things like, the air smells funny, therefore it's poison, or God is angry, therefore everyone should flagellate themselves in public squares until their neighbors feel even worse. The science wasn't exactly there yet. But the plague spreads anyway. It doesn't care if you understand germ theory. And when people started noticing that their neighbors were keeling over with boils the size of apples, they quickly realized they should probably do something about it. Let's begin with the most obvious survival tactic: running away. Now, if you were rich, you could actually do this. You pack up your tapestries, you grab your household staff, and you retreat to a country estate. Boccaccio's Decameron famously begins this way. A group of wealthy Florentines retreat to a villa outside the city, where they pass the time telling scandalous stories, probably while sipping wine and pretending the world isn't collapsing a few miles away. But what if you were not wealthy? What if you were, say, a shoemaker who had never seen a villa in his life? Well, you might still run away, but your options were limited. Some villagers would try to flee into the woods. Others would camp out in fields. Whole families would abandon their homes, just hoping the fresh air of the countryside would protect them. It kind of worked until the plague followed them anyway, because fleas don't care about your rustic lifestyle. Another tactic was locking yourself indoors. Medieval advice manuals, written by physicians who were basically guessing, often suggested sealing yourself from corrupt air. So families literally bricked themselves inside their houses. Sometimes they stuffed rags in the keyholes, or pasted wax around the windows to block out the supposed poisonous miasma. Did it work? Not really. Because while they were busy trying to keep out bad air, they were still sharing their rooms with the real culprits, fleas and rats. So yes, congratulations, you've just invented the medieval version of quarantine, except you quarantined yourself with the plague already in the room. Let's float over to another strategy: magic and religion. When you don't have medicine, you lean on faith, charms, and whatever mystical nonsense you can grab. People wore amulets made of dried herbs. Some wore tiny bags with crushed emeralds or ground pearls, because expensive rocks obviously scare bacteria away. Others clutched wax figures of saints, or carried prayers written on scraps of parchment, folded and worn like jewelry. Some households literally hung onions and garlic in the windows, not to cook with, just to ward off evil. Apparently, they thought if your house smelled like a bad salad, the plague would politely pass by. There's also the famous posies thing, bouquets of flowers carried around to sweeten the air. Yes, this is the origin of Ring Around the Rosie. Except, spoiler, the rhyme wasn't actually from the 14th century. That's a Victorian myth. But people did carry flowers, sometimes even holding them to their nose in public, as if inhaling roses would cancel out the smell of rotting corpses on the street. Speaking of smells, here's a fun medieval solution: fire and smoke. People thought smoke purified the air, so entire towns lit bonfires to ward off disease. Families burned juniper branches inside their houses. Some doctors even recommended carrying a small fire pot around, waving it like a portable air freshener. One chronicler describes how in one city, so much incense and smoke was burned in the streets that you could barely see anything through the haze. Which must have been comforting? Unless you had asthma, in which case, good luck. Now, some people took a more aggressive religious approach. Enter the flagellants. These were groups of traveling penitents who whipped themselves in public to atone for humanity's sins. Because obviously, the plague was punishment from God. And what better way to appease him than by staging a bloody street performance? Ordinary villagers often joined in, or at least watched. Some even hoped the flagellant sacrifice would shield their town. But authorities, including the Pope, eventually banned the movement, partly because it spread panic, and partly because the flagellants tended to stir up anti-Jewish violence, blaming Jewish communities for poisoning wells. So, not exactly a wholesome neighborhood activity. Let's not forget the very practical option: blaming strangers. When you're terrified, you want someone to blame. So rumors spread that foreigners, beggars, or lepers were secretly spreading the plague. Jewish communities in particular were accused of poisoning wells, and many were massacred. For ordinary Christians, this meant joining mobs or hiding at home while mobs did their thing, both versions framed as protection. If you were Jewish, on the other hand, hiding from the plague often meant literally hiding from your neighbors. Whole Jewish families fled from one city to another, only to be chased out again. So, survival sometimes meant running from both the disease and the people around you. Another layer of hiding came in the form of diet and lifestyle advice. Doctors recommended moderation. Eat lightly, avoid baths, since they supposedly opened your pores to bad air, and don't overindulge in meat or wine. Ordinary people tried to follow these rules in clumsy ways. For instance, one manual said, "Don't eat fruit." So some families literally banned apples and pears from the household, as if that would make a difference. Others adopted the opposite approach, drinking more wine, because clearly alcohol keeps disease away. And let's be honest, if your whole street is dying, maybe a bit of extra wine isn't the worst idea. But here's one of my favorite medieval survival hacks: hiding in monasteries. Some ordinary folk thought, hey, monks live holy lives, maybe they're safe. So they ran to monasteries for shelter. Unfortunately, monasteries were actually some of the worst plague hotspots because monks lived in close quarters and cared for the sick. So, hiding with the monks often meant signing your own death warrant, but at least you got some free chanting before the end. And then, of course, there was the oldest method of all: denial. Some people simply refused to believe the plague was real. They kept going to markets, to church, to festivals. Chroniclers record stories of weddings held in plague-stricken towns, with everyone drinking and dancing as if nothing was wrong. A week later, half the wedding party was gone. So yes, pretend it's not happening was definitely a strategy. Not a good one, but a very human one. When we put all these strategies together, what do we see? Ordinary people in the 14th century didn't really hide from the Black Death in the way we imagine hiding today. They didn't have masks or proper quarantines or vaccines. They had herbs, superstition, and blind hope. Some ran to the countryside. Some locked their doors and stuffed rags in the cracks. Some burned incense until they choked. And some just carried on as usual, because stopping life altogether was too much to bear. It's easy for us to laugh at their ideas, to roll our eyes at the garlic necklaces and the jewel amulets. But, in a way, they weren't so different from us. In times of panic, people grab whatever comfort they can find. And whether that's stuffing your windows with wax or binge-watching 3 seasons of a sitcom in one night, the instinct is the same. Just trying to feel safe, even when you're not. And that's where we'll leave this first drift into the world of ordinary plague survival. Next time, we'll float further into the little details, the strange village rituals, the plague houses, and the people who actually tried to make money off the whole disaster. But for now, just stay wrapped up. If you were unlucky enough to get sick, or unlucky enough to live with someone sick, you might find your entire household marked off. Officials, or sometimes just nosy neighbors, would nail boards across your door, paint a cross on it, or post a notice saying, "Yup, everyone inside is infected. Good luck." This was medieval quarantine in its purest form. It meant you weren't going anywhere. Food might be delivered, or maybe not, depending on how generous or terrified your neighbors were. Imagine sitting in a one-room cottage with family members coughing, rats scurrying, and a crowd outside whispering about how you were basically a walking corpse. Not exactly the spa retreat you were hoping for. Sometimes entire streets were boarded up, turning them into ghostly dead zones. The logic was simple: wall in the sickness, even if you also wall in the people. But, of course, not everyone obeyed the rules. If you had money, you could bribe someone to let you out. If you were desperate, you could sneak out a back window at night. And naturally, these escapees spread the plague to brand new neighborhoods. So, plague houses were both a survival tactic and, ironically, a reason the disease kept spreading. Now let's float over to another important figure in this grim little ecosystem, the plague doctor. We all know the image: the long-beaked mask, the black robe, the stick to poke patients from a safe distance. But here's the fun twist: during the 14th century Black Death, that outfit didn't exist yet. Sorry to ruin the aesthetic. The famous bird mask actually comes from the 17th century, centuries later. In the 1340s, plague doctors just wore whatever passed as normal physician clothing, which was, to be fair, usually a long robe. They did sometimes cover their faces with cloths soaked in herbs, because, again, the bad air theory. But in reality, many plague doctors were just local men with very little medical training. Sometimes they were actual university-trained physicians, but more often they were random folks who accepted the job no one else wanted. Imagine being the unlucky guy chosen as plague inspector because you once helped your neighbor bandage a cut. Still, ordinary people turned to these figures for advice. What did the doctors recommend? Lots of contradictory nonsense. Don't eat hot foods. Don't eat cold foods. Don't have sex. Actually, maybe do have sex, just moderately. Basically, whatever advice fit into the medieval idea of balancing your bodily humors. Too much heat? Bad. Too much cold? Also bad. The goal was to be boringly lukewarm in all things, which is not exactly inspiring medical guidance. Now, let's wander into something both bleak and a little funny: the business of survival. When half the population is dying, it turns out there are still people trying to make a profit. Gravediggers suddenly became very valuable because you couldn't exactly bury yourself. Some charged outrageous fees, knowing desperate families had no choice. Others simply dumped bodies into mass pits, then demanded extra payment to say a prayer, which may or may not have actually been said. Priests, too, sometimes doubled their fees for funerals. And let's be real, funerals were a booming industry in the 1340s. A priest might officiate dozens in a week, muttering the words so fast they barely registered. Talk about an assembly line approach to death. And of course, herbalists and apothecaries were thrilled to sell you protective charms, powders, or little vials of perfume. Did they work? No, but ordinary people spent what little they had because buying hope feels better than buying nothing. Speaking of buying hope, let's talk about protective clothing. Some workers in plague-ridden towns improvised early PPE. But instead of masks and gloves, they used things like wax-coated cloaks or amulets sewn into their sleeves. Butchers sometimes tied frog skins to their belts, thinking it absorbed poison. And midwives, who were already blamed for practically everything, wore sprigs of rosemary in their hair to signal protection. If you were rich, you could commission talismans inscribed with astrological symbols. One wealthy merchant had a belt engraved with the names of the three magi, believing it would repel illness. Spoiler, it didn't. Now, not all strategies were individual. Communities also tried collective measures. Markets were sometimes closed, though not very effectively, because how do you stop people from needing bread? Public baths were shut down, since warm water was believed to open pores and let in bad air. Taverns, on the other hand, stayed suspiciously open, because even in a plague, nobody wanted to give up their beer. Some towns instituted what we might call social distancing. Officials banned large festivals and processions. But again, people broke. Let's drift to the countryside again, because hiding in rural areas came with its own quirks. Peasants sometimes built makeshift huts away from the main village, basically plague shacks. Whole families camped in fields, thinking isolation would keep them safe. It sometimes worked if they managed to avoid visitors, but often they starved. Because living in a shack without supplies in the 14th century wasn't exactly sustainable. Some farmers also tried to protect themselves by avoiding animal slaughter. They noticed that handling livestock often led to outbreaks in the household. So some refused to butcher pigs or cows, even if it meant going hungry. This wasn't science, but it was at least a useful observation, since fleas really did jump from rodents to livestock to humans. And then there were the superstitions that blended survival with theater. In some villages, people rang church bells constantly, believing the sound kept plague spirits away. Others fired cannons into the air for the same reason. Imagine trying to nap through an endless chorus of bells and random explosions. It must have been restful. In certain alpine towns, villagers carried relics around the perimeter of the settlement, forming a holy barrier. Some swore this kept the plague out. Others noticed it did nothing, but hey, it gave people something to do besides panic. Now, I mentioned earlier that monasteries weren't exactly safe. But it's worth pausing on how religious communities handled survival. Some monks stayed locked in cloisters, refusing to admit outsiders. They prayed, fasted, and avoided contact. This sometimes spared them, but more often the disease still slipped in. Entire monastic houses were wiped out, leaving only a couple of survivors to write grim little notes in the margins of their manuscripts. Ordinary people looked at this and thought, if even monks can't survive, what chance do we have? So some decided survival wasn't possible at all, and instead leaned fully into hedonism. There are accounts of taverns overflowing, gambling dens running nonstop, and people saying, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die," which honestly is about the most relatable human response of the whole era. One last angle for tonight, the children. Because when adults panic, children adapt in strange ways. Some kids played plague-themed games, like mock funerals in the street. Others made up rhymes about death, some of which echoed down into later centuries. Ordinary families sometimes sent children to live with distant relatives in the hope they'd be spared. But sending them away often meant never seeing them again. Still, you can imagine a small boy or girl sitting in a cottage with garlic hanging from the rafters, bells tolling outside, and everyone whispering about bad air, just quietly inventing games to make sense of it all. A strangely human, strangely universal coping mechanism. So when we put this part together, what do we see? Ordinary people didn't just hide from the plague. They improvised. They locked doors. They bribed doctors. They made business out of funerals. They camped in fields, rang bells, and wore rosemary crowns. Some strategies worked a little. Most didn't. But every action, even the foolish ones, was really just an attempt to make the unbearable feel manageable. And if you've ever stocked up on too much toilet paper or bought a scented candle because it cleanses the energy, then you probably understand them better than you think. Let's let this drift to silence for now. Next, we'll slip further into the aftermath, the way plague survival reshaped families, economies, and entire villages. Because hiding wasn't just about those desperate months. It left scars that lasted for generations. So stay tucked in. Let your mind wander gently away from the sound of bells, cannons, and garlic. And remember, even in the worst of times, we've seen how ordinary people ran to the woods, sealed up their houses, waved garlic around, and prayed the air would stop being so bad. But what about afterward? What did life look like once the plague had passed through, assuming you were one of the lucky ones still breathing? Because the truth is, hiding was never just about the moment. It reshaped families. It changed how land was farmed. And it left psychological scars you could see for generations. Let's begin with the empty houses. Imagine walking down a village street in 1350, just after the plague wave had finally burned out. Half the doors are shut permanently. Cottages are abandoned, fields are overgrown, and the only sound is the creaking of shutters in the wind. For survivors, hiding often ended with emerging into something that didn't feel like home anymore. Your neighbors weren't there. Your friends were gone. Maybe even your entire extended family had vanished. Chronicles describe villages reduced to just a handful of families. Some places were so depopulated they simply disappeared from the map. One English record notes that a village priest went from conducting 30 baptisms a year to none at all because there were no new babies and barely any parents left. Now, here's where it gets interesting: land and inheritance. If you were an ordinary peasant and your family died, suddenly you might find yourself the sole heir to multiple fields or even whole farms. This happened a lot. Land that once had 5 or 6 heirs now funneled into the hands of one surviving child. So, paradoxically, hiding successfully could make you richer. Families that managed to outlast the plague sometimes rose in status afterward. Ordinary villagers suddenly owned more cows, more sheep, or more vineyards than they could ever have expected. But, of course, it came with a price. Your wealth was literally built on the graves of your relatives, which is not exactly the kind of inheritance you want to brag about at the tavern. Speaking of taverns, let's talk about labor shortages. With half the workforce gone, the survivors who could work were suddenly in high demand. If you were a plowman, you could charge double for your services. If you were a maidservant, you might negotiate a wage you'd never dream of before. In fact, ordinary people got cheeky with this. Records show peasants walking off jobs, refusing to work for old feudal obligations, and demanding payment instead, which annoyed the landlords, of course. In England, the government even passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, basically saying, stop asking for higher wages or else. Spoiler, it didn't work. Because when half the bakers are dead, the surviving bakers are going to name their price. So, hiding from the plague could make you come out into a world where, for once, ordinary labor actually had bargaining power. A small silver lining in an otherwise very grim time. Now, let's float into the psychological aftermath. When you've been hiding for months, cooped up in a dark cottage, listening to the bells toll for the dead, you don't just go back to normal. Survivors carried trauma, even if they didn't have that word for it. Some became deeply religious, convinced God had spared them for a reason. They doubled down on prayer, fasting, and pilgrimages. Ordinary villagers trudged hundreds of miles to shrines, leaving offerings, hoping never to face such wrath again. Others went the opposite direction, complete cynicism. One chronicler notes that after the plague, people became more greedy and more self-indulgent. In plain terms, we survived, so let's party and take advantage of everything. This meant more drinking, more gambling, and more scandals in parish records about people having affairs instead of attending church. So, hiding ended either in religious zeal or in YOLO behavior, centuries before anyone said YOLO. Now, here's a smaller but fascinating detail: marriage markets. With so many widows and widowers, the number of remarriages skyrocketed. Survivors didn't waste much time. If your spouse had died last month, you might be married again by next season. Partly because of loneliness, but also because managing a household was nearly impossible. This reshaped family trees all across Europe. Children suddenly had half-siblings from remarriages. Step-families became incredibly common. So, a girl who had been hiding with her mother during the plague might suddenly find herself living with a brand new father. Now, let's move into faith and superstition lingering afterward. Remember the garlic, the herbs, the amulets. Those didn't go away. Survivors clung to them even more tightly as symbols of what had worked. If your grandmother survived while wearing a dried toad around her neck, you'd probably keep that toad forever, not because it actually saved her, but because you wanted to believe in something. Some villages even developed local miracle objects, a saint statue that hadn't been toppled during the plague, a relic that seemed untouched. Ordinary people made pilgrimages to these items, hoping they carried permanent protection. So hiding strategies became traditions, even when the logic behind them was long disproven. Let's not forget the abandoned farms and fields. In many places, crops went unharvested for years. Whole orchards were left to rot. Sheep wandered freely, multiplying in numbers until they outnumbered humans in some regions. So England suddenly had a wool boom. Fewer people meant more land for sheep, and more sheep meant more wool to sell abroad. So while peasants were hiding and villages were collapsing, the wool trade was quietly gearing up for its golden age. It's one of those ironic contrasts: ordinary people starving in plague huts, while fluffy herds were basically having the time of their lives in abandoned pastures. Now here's a more personal angle: the return from hiding. Imagine you're a child sent away to a distant relative during the plague. Months later, you're brought home only to find your parents gone, or maybe your house abandoned. Children were shuffled into new homes, raised by uncles, cousins, or sometimes the parish itself. This created a whole generation of orphans, ordinary kids who had once played in the street, now wandering with no clear place to belong. Some grew up into hardened wanderers, joining bands of beggars and thieves. Others were absorbed into wealthier households as servants, basically disappearing into someone else's family history. So, hiding didn't always mean safety. Sometimes it meant coming back to a life that had no place for you anymore. And let's glide toward one last point tonight: memory and storytelling. Ordinary people told and retold plague stories for decades afterward. Grandparents would whisper about how they'd hidden in a barn or bricked themselves in with onions at the window. Children grew up hearing tales of the year when the air was poisoned and the bells never stopped. These stories became folklore, shaping how entire communities understood disease for centuries. Even when the actual science was nonsense, the memory of hiding, of doing something, was passed down as a kind of survival wisdom. So, the legacy of hiding from the Black Death wasn't just in the empty houses or the wealth redistribution. It was also in the quiet bedtime tales that made children clutch their blankets a little tighter, not unlike what we're doing right now. So, to gather this all together, hiding from the Black Death didn't just mean garlic necklaces or running to the woods. It meant emerging into a world forever altered, empty villages, new families, new wealth for some, despair for others, and a long shadow of superstition, trauma, and half-remembered survival tricks that echoed down the generations. Ordinary people didn't just hide. They rebuilt, they remembered, and they carried their strange little coping methods into the future. That's where we'll close part 3. Next time, we'll keep drifting, this time into the social shifts that hiding created. Changes in religion, peasant rebellions, and even the quiet rise of the middle class. Because hiding didn't just keep people alive. It quietly set the stage for an entirely new Europe. So, stay cozy, stay calm, and let the bells and whispers of the 14th century fade gently into the background.